In the far northwest of Australia, there is a lake so large you cannot see across it. It's called Lake Argyle, and 17 metres down, under all that still water, lies a valley. And in that valley once stood a house built of stone by an Irishman who had walked a continent to reach the ground it sat on. In 1971, before the water came, men went into that house and took it apart. They numbered every single stone, carted them 15 kilometres away, and built the house again on higher ground, where it stands today, looking out over the drowned country it once commanded. The family who built it had come from Queensland on foot, behind 7,250 cattle. The journey took 2 years and 4 months. Half the cattle died getting there. So did several of the men. That family held this country for 64 years, and then, in a single afternoon in an office, they signed every acre of it away. This is ancient Aussie history, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify. Link below. Tonight isn't a mystery of lights in the sky. It's the true story of the greatest cattle empire this continent ever produced. The Irish family who built it, the far older nations whose country it was carved from, and the reckoning that has caught up with the name a century later. Chapter 1. The boy who buried his father. The family came out of County Clare, in the west of Ireland. Tenant farmers who had lived through the famine and decided there was nothing left to stay for. They sailed on a ship called the Harriet and landed in New South Wales in May of 1853. Patrick Durack, the eldest son, was 19. Everyone called him Patsy. Within 2 months of stepping off that ship, his father Michael was dead, a farming accident near Goulburn in the very country that was supposed to save them. And so Patsy Durack stood at a fresh grave in a place he had known for 8 weeks, the eldest of a family with no money, no land, and no man left in it but him. What he did next tells you everything. He walked south to the goldfields on the Ovens River in Victoria and dug. Not lucky, not clever, but relentless. And about 18 months later, came back with 1,000 pounds clawed out of a river with his hands. He bought a holding outside Goulburn, brought his mother and siblings onto it, and in 1862 married Mary Costello. He was 28, with land and a wife, and by any measure he had already won. One thing worth clearing up, because people mix these families up constantly. The great book about the Duracks, kings in grass castles, is not about Sydney Kidman, a different man and a different empire. This one belongs to a family from County Clare, because Patsy Durack looked at his safe little farm, and in 1863 he did something any sensible man would have called a fast way to die broke in the desert. Chapter 2. Thylungra. He went west. Not to a district or a town, but into country that had no name on any map that mattered, out past the settled edge of New South Wales and into southwest Queensland. He took his brother Michael, a short, powerfully built man the family called Stumpy Michael, and his brother-in-law John Costello. They took everything they owned, and the drought took all of it. Every animal died. The men very nearly died with them. And here is the detail the Australian Dictionary of Biography records in plain language, and which the family never disputed. The party survived only with the help of desert Aboriginal people who fed them and showed them water. That is not decoration. The single hardest problem in inland Australia is water, and the only people who knew where it was, in country no European had crossed, were those who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. Every pastoral fortune in the 19th century inland rests on knowledge taken or given by Aboriginal people. And the Durack fortune is no exception. It's the first thing that happens in this story, and it sets the shape of everything after. They raised more money and went out again. In 1868, they took up country on a tributary of Cooper's Creek and called it Thylungra, from a local word meaning permanent water. They started with about 100 head and lived 5 years in bark and canvas. And it worked. By 1877, the herd was around 30,000. By 1879, Patsy was on his way to his first £500,000, raw dust turned into a Queensland fortune inside 11 years. Then Queensland began to fill up, and the price of new country climbed beyond what even a rich man wanted to pay. So Patsy, nearly 50, looked west. At the last part of the continent still unclaimed, he sent Stumpy Michael by sea to Cambridge Gulf, and Stumpy Michael came back and said the valley of the Ord River was the finest cattle country he had ever seen. Black soil, grass to a horse's belly, permanent water, nobody grazing it. It was 2,000 miles away, with no road, no railway, no port, and no way to get cattle there except to walk them. So Patsy Durack sold the fortune he'd already made and bet every penny on walking his herd across a continent. Chapter 3, 2 years and 4 months. In 1883, the mob went out from Thylungra, 7,250 head of breeding cattle and 200 horses, pointed northwest toward a river most of the men had never seen. A mob that size doesn't travel at the speed of a horse. It travels at the speed of grass because cattle eat as they walk, and if you push them faster than they can feed, they die. 10 miles was a good day. Some days they made none at all. 2 years and 4 months is not a figure of speech. It is 1,000 consecutive days of that. They crossed the Channel Country, the Barkly Tableland, the Victoria River District, some of the hardest ground on earth. The cattle died in the crossings and on the dry stages. The horses drowned, and the men died too. Fever took some, the rivers took others. 3 of the company never finished, buried where they fell. They reached the Ord in 1885. Of the 7,250 cattle that walked out of Thylungra, about half arrived. The venture cost roughly £72,000, and Patsy had gambled everything on it. The Australian Dictionary of Biography. In an entry written by Patsy's own granddaughter, Mary, calls it the longest overland drive undertaken by Australian drovers up to that time. They stood on the banks of the Ord, looked out at a valley of black soil and long grass with no fence on it, and believed they had found empty country. It was not empty. It had been occupied for tens of thousands of years. Chapter 4. The country that was already taken. The valley of the Ord is Miriwong country. To the north and east are the Gajerong. South of them, the Gija, and beyond them, the Jaru and the Malnjan. These are not vague categories. They are nations, with boundaries, languages, law, and title, who had held that country since before Ireland had a written history. Trade routes carried pearl shell 1,000 miles inland. Songlines crossed it. Every waterhole had a name, an owner, and rules about who could drink from it. And the same black soil plains Stumpy Michael valued as fattening country had been valued by the Miriwong for far older reasons. What Patsy Durack held was not ownership as we normally use the word. It was a pastoral lease, a document issued in Perth, 2,000 miles away, granting the right to run cattle across country the men issuing it had never seen, and whose owners they had never asked. That is the whole legal foundation of the empire, and everything that follows comes out of it. In 1886, the Duracks established Argyle Downs and Ivanhoe stations near the mouth of the Ord, and the same year, the first police arrived. Cattle foul the waterholes and eat out the grass, and the animals people had hunted for millennia go elsewhere. So the people speared the cattle, because the cattle were now standing on their food. And the pastoralists answered as they answered right across the north, with rifles and with police. A speared beast was money lost. The law recognised the pastoralists' cattle as property and recognised no real rights at all in the people whose country the cattle were eating. In 1892, Parliament even made cattle spearing a criminal offence and brought back flogging as punishment. And in November of 1886, near Mount Duncan, that collision killed a Durack. What followed was the largest massacre event in the recorded history of Western Australia. Chapter 5. Big Johnny. On the 17th of November 1886, John Durack, a nephew of Patsy's, known to everyone as Big Johnny, was riding with his cousin John Wallace Durack near Mount Duncan on the Northern Territory side of the border. They were ambushed. Big Johnny was speared and died. John Wallace got away. and lived to be an old man. A party of around 20 rode out after them. Police, civilians, and Michael Durack, Big Johnny's own kin, among them. This was the standard response of that district, and it had a name everyone used without embarrassment: a punitive expedition. It was not an investigation. It aimed at what the language of the time called dispersal, and dispersal meant shooting. What that party did is recorded in 4 very different ways, and the honest thing is to give you all of them. The official police report recorded 2 men killed, described as the ringleaders. 2. 6 years later, a solicitor wrote to the West Australian alleging that 100 or 150 people had been slaughtered in cold blood. A police file from the same period records a settler admitting that he, with others, had rounded up about 120 people and shot a large number, including men, women, and children. And in March of 2022, the University of Newcastle's Colonial Frontier Massacres Project concluded that 3 separate massacres were carried out in reprisal for Big Johnny's death, and that more than 220 Aboriginal people were killed. It is, on their finding, the largest massacre event in the history of Western Australia. The killing went on for weeks and crossed the border between 2 colonies. Those 4 accounts cannot be reconciled, and nobody should try. The gap between 2 and 220 is the whole story of frontier record-keeping in this country. The official file was written by the men who did the shooting, for a government 2,000 miles away. And 2 things need saying, because both are true. First, the reprisals were carried out by police and civilian volunteers, and no member of the Durack family has ever been shown in any archive to have personally fired a shot in them. Michael Durack rode with the party. That is documented. Anything beyond it is not. Second, the men who did this were not hiding. One civilian who led punitive expeditions in that country was still writing about it 50 years later, in memoirs serialised in a Perth newspaper in 1937, and the tone in which he counted the dead was pride. Chapter 6, Grass Castles. The empire went up fast after that. Argyle Downs, Ivanhoe, Lissadell, Rosewood, Auvergne and Newry across the territory border. 5 stations covering an area the size of Belgium. And the cost was paid in the family's own blood too. In 1893, Mary Costello Durack died of malaria at Argyle, aged 52. The year after, Patsy and his sons began building a house of local stone, finished in 1895, the mortar reportedly made from crushed termite mounds, the only cement that country offered. It was the first permanent building in that valley, and it said something simple: we are not leaving. But the men who quarried and cut and laid most of that stone were Aboriginal men, working for rations. The house that stands today as the monument to the Durack family was built, in large part, by Miriwong hands. In 1897, the enterprise was incorporated as Connor, Doherty and Durack Limited. The empire had become a company. And in 1898, Patrick Durack died at Fremantle, aged 63. 3 years later, his brother Jeremiah, who had founded Rosewood, was speared and killed while he slept on the veranda of his own homestead. 15 years after Big Johnny died, the frontier was still killing Duracks in their beds. The man who inherited the running of it all was Patsy's son, Michael Patrick, who would hold it for 50 years and be the last Durack to run cattle on that country. Chapter 7, The Men Who Ran It. Michael Patrick Durack, known in the family as MPD and to half the Kimberley as Miguel, was managing director of the company and the member for Kimberley in the WA Parliament from 1917 to 1924. For half a century, he was the empire. But he did not muster the cattle. The empire ran year to year on Aboriginal labour. Miriwong and Geisha stockmen worked those stations, and every account agrees on their quality. Exceptional horsemen and cattlemen, working country their families had known for thousands of years, which is exactly why they were better at it than anyone the company could have brought in. If you're still with me this far into the story, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the part most tellings leave out. Whole families lived on those stations for generations, and the stations could not have functioned without them for a single season. Mustering meant weeks in the saddle across huge unfenced runs, handling half-wild cattle, a skill you could not hire in Perth. It belonged to the very people the company was paying in flour, because they were not paid wages. They were paid in rations, an arrangement that lasted on the Kimberley stations until 1968. And what that world was like depends on who you ask, and both answers are on the record. A Gadgerong stockman named Jack Sullivan, who told his life story in the early 1980s, said pastoralists in the Kimberley would put a bullet in men who could not be tamed and made to work. He grew up watching shooting everywhere. Ben Ward, a Miriwong elder born in 1949, taken from his family as a child, also worked those stations and has spoken warmly of the kindness of the Durack family and supported their name being kept on the map. Both men are telling the truth about the country they lived in. Both truths belong in the same story. Chapter 8, The Offer. Then the Depression came for the price of beef, and by the late 1930s the company was deep in debt. And in 1939, Michael Patrick Durack offered the whole thing to the Jews of Europe. The Freeland League for Jewish Territorial Colonization, led by Dr. Isaac Nachman Steinberg, a Russian who had been the Bolshevik Commissar of Justice before he fell out with Lenin, was not Zionist. It did not want Palestine. It wanted land, anywhere on earth, for Jews who, by 1939, after Kristallnacht and the failure of the Avian Conference, were running out of places to go. Durack offered them the leases. Argyle Downs, Ivanhoe, Auvergne and Newry, over 7 million acres, as a homeland for as many as 75,000 refugees. In May of 1939, Steinberg landed in Perth and spent weeks touring the Kimberley, a former Bolshevik Commissar of Justice working out where you would put a nation. And Durack's own explanation is the reason the offer is not simple charity. Australia, he said, is not morally entitled to hold the North unless she makes some attempt to develop it. The Premier gave state consent. Archbishop Mannix and the ACTU backed it. The Graziers and much of the Zionist movement did not. Then the war came to the Kimberley itself, and the plan died slowly, ending in a letter from Prime Minister John Curtin refusing to depart from long-established policy on alien settlement. By the time the League's last appeals were refused, the people it had been meant to save were already dead. Chapter 9, 1950, and the Drowned Country. The Empire ended in a single year, the way these things usually do. In an office, on paper. In 1950, against the wishes of most of his family, Michael Patrick Durack sold Connor, Doherty and Durack. The stations, the stock, the leases, the lot. 64 years after the first Durack cattle reached the Ord, the family walked off the country in a boardroom. 3 weeks after finalising it, Michael Patrick Durack died, and the Ivanhoe homestead burned to the ground the same day. The last cattle king of the Kimberley, master of 5 stations the size of Belgium, left around £61,000 and 1 small block. The empire did not survive him for the same reason great pastoral dynasties fail everywhere. It was held together by one man, and when he went, there was nobody behind him who wanted it. His children were remarkable. They were simply not cattlemen. Mary Durack wrote Kings in Grass Castles, the only reason most Australians have ever heard the name. Her sister Elizabeth became a significant artist. Her brother Peter became a senator and attorney general. Not one of them took the cattle. And 21 years after the sale, the Ord irrigation scheme, dreamed up by Kim Durack during the war, came for the very valley his grandfather had crossed a continent to reach. The Ord River Dam was completed in 1971, and the water began to rise. The Argyle Downs homestead stood directly in its path, so men went in with chisels and numbers and took it apart, every stone coded and carted into Kununurra and rebuilt 15 kilometres away, above the waterline. In 1979, it opened as a museum, and it is still there. But the water came faster than anyone forecast, and Aboriginal sacred objects in caves along the valley were lost beneath it. The lake that filled that valley is the largest artificial body of water in Australia, and everything the region has become since. The irrigation farms, the town of Kununurra, came out of it. The scheme worked. It just arrived 21 years too late to save the family whose valley paid for it. And 3 years before the water, in 1968, the equal wage decision finally reached the northern stations. Aboriginal stockmen who had worked that country for rations for 80 years were entitled, at last, to be paid. What happened next is well documented. Rather than pay, many stations let their workers go, and families who had lived on that country for generations, on their own country, were moved off it. Chapter 10. They could not move the country. Which brings us back to Mary Durack. In 1959, she wrote of a conspiracy of silence among the pioneers, and people quote that line as an admission. The full sentence is not one. She wrote that the silence added colour to the rumours, so that while the pioneers took much rough justice into their own hands, they were no doubt less devastating to the local tribes than was sometimes said. She recorded the violence, and in the same breath she made it smaller. The fuller account came from elsewhere. From Chris Owen going through police files, from the Newcastle historians counting the dead, from Jack Sullivan telling a stranger what he had watched as a boy. Mary got closer later, writing a lament in the voice of a Miriwong woman for the valley going under. This is not a family that can be reduced to heroes or to villains. It is more complicated and more honest than that. And so is the country it came from. So go and look for the empire now. Argyle Downs, Ivanhoe, Auvergne and Newry have passed through corporate hands and then offshore. The country the Duracks walked a continent to reach is largely foreign-owned today. But in December of 2003, after the longest hearing in the history of the Federal Court of Australia, the Miriwong and Gadgerong people were recognised as the native title holders of that country. The Ord irrigation area, the town, Lake Argyle itself, the valley under the water, legally theirs, and always was. The name is still on the map. The federal electorate of Durack is the largest in the country. The books are still in print, and the stone house still stands on its hill above the water, rebuilt out of numbered stones, looking down at 17 metres of lake over the paddock where Patsy Durack finally put his cattle down after 2 years and 4 months on the road, having lost half of them getting there. They moved the house. They could not move the country. If this is the kind of unresolved Australian story you want more of, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.